The story of Esther centers around Queen Vashti, King Ahasuerus, Esther, Mordecai, Haman, and the Jewish people. If you are not already familiar with these individuals, they have been briefly introduced to us in the following paragraphs. Who was Esther? 1. Queen Vashti disobeyed the drunken orders of her husband, King Ahasuerus, so he divorced her. Lonely, he sought a new queen, the most beautiful woman in the land. A young Jewish orphan Esther was chosen, but she was careful to keep her Jewish identity secret. Esther, predecessor, Vashti, born Hadassah, Achaemenid Empire, spouse Ahasuerus, father Abihail, biological, Mordecai, adoptive. Religion, Judaism. Mordecai, Esther's uncle, offended a high court official called Haman, who decided to kill not only Mordecai but all the Jews in the Persian Empire, the first recorded extermination against the Jews. Esther turned the tables on Mordecai. She pleaded with the king, and Haman was punished, hanged on the very gallows he had built for Mordecai. 2. The Jewish people in Persia were saved. An annual festival, Purim, commemorated the courage of Esther and the deliverance of the Jews. Purim is a Jewish holiday that commemorates the saving of the Jewish people from Haman, an Achaemenid Persian Empire official who was planning to kill all the Jews in the empire, as reported in the book of Esther. The Achaemenid Empire, also called the First Persian Empire, was an ancient Iranian empire based in Western Asia and founded by Cyrus the Great in 550 BC. Christianity is sometimes accused of causing the anti-Semitism that has shamed the modern world. This story shows that prejudice existed long before the birth of Jesus. Why was Queen Vashti banished? She refused to comply with the king's command to join him in the palace at Susa, where the banquet was held. See number 1. How do we meet Esther? The story of Esther began at a magnificent banquet at the court of the Persian king, Ahasuerus, usually thought to be the Emperor Xerxes, 486-465 BC. 2 banquets. Why? 2 separate banquets were being held. One for the king, his counselors, and all the influential men of Susa, 2. Queen Vashti gave the other for the women of the court and nobility. Having drunk far too much wine, King Ahasuerus sent for his queen. She was noted for her beauty, and he wished to show her off to the city's men. He ordered her to appear before the men at his banquet. What was the queen's reaction? The queen of the Persian Empire was chosen from among the empire's 7 most ancient and noble families, and Vashti was of ancient and noble lineage. He was drunk with wine. He sent his beautiful queen, Vashti, to appear before the men. She refused to come. Humiliated, the king banished her. However, now he was lonely, so a search was made. The loveliest girl would become his new queen. She would not have relished the prospect of being paraded in front of a room full of drunken men. It was not a sensible thing for a queen to do. Men and women often dined together in ancient Persia, but as the dinner progressed and more wine was drunk, the wives left the dining area and were replaced by concubines. She refused to come. On the 7th day, when the king was merry with wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who attended him to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing the royal crown, to show the peoples and the officials her beauty, for she was fair to behold. But Queen Vashti refused to come. At this the king was enraged, and his anger burned within him. Read Esther 1:1-122. Why did Vashti refuse to appear? Vashti may have thought she was treated as a concubine rather than a wife and queen. She behaved with haughty dignity when she refused the king's command. However, unfortunately, her answer was given in front of the officers of the empire, and she paid the price for humiliating the king. What was the king's reaction to his wife's refusal? Ahasuerus, still half drunk, acted hastily. On the advice of cowed and inept counselors, he made the situation worse by issuing a public decree that Vashti was to be banished. This drew even more attention to the fact that Vashti had ignored his command and made him look like a fool to all his subjects. At this stage in the story, it becomes evident that this is not a traditional story about a good king. Ahasuerus was a tyrant who was also a fool. So a theme begins to emerge. Unlimited power, exercised without wisdom, is dangerous, the lonely king. After a while, Ahasuerus found that he was lonely without Vashti, the beloved one. He could not call her back because his word, once spoken, was law. So his courtiers suggested a solution: to find another queen, a young and beautiful woman who would take Vashti's place. Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in all the province of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in the citadel of Susa, under custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetic treatments be given them. Let the girl who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This pleased the king, and he did so. Read Esther 2:1-23. The search for a beautiful virgin. The first recorded beauty contest began a nationwide search for a new queen. A young Jewess was among the candidates. Her beauty was so extraordinary that she pleased even the chief eunuch Hegai, who had been castrated while still a boy. There is a note of irony here. One wonders, too, at the backstory to all this. Did Hegai play some part in deposing Vashti? Esther prepares, and it works. Esther and the other young virgins were taken into the harem, and 12 months of careful preparation began. She was shrewd enough to seek the advice of Hegai, who knew the king's tastes. Eventually, she went to the king and pleased him so much that he set the royal crown on her head. She became queen in Vashti's place, with all the wealth and power of an Eastern queen now suddenly at her disposal. Why did Esther's story mean so much to Jews? Esther was a symbol of Jews who lived successfully in an alien culture. As a woman, she was not in a position of power, just as diaspora Jews were not members of the power elite. As an orphan, she was separated from her parents, as diaspora Jews are separated from their mother country. With these handicaps, she had to use every skill and advantage she had, as diaspora Jews did. They, like Esther, had to adapt themselves to the situation. Esther and Mordecai. From the start, Esther had been helped by her cousin Mordecai, but nobody knew that they were related, or that Esther was a Jewess. Esther did not keep the dietary laws of Judaism or retain the practices of an Orthodox Jewess. God is never mentioned directly in the story, so the story is not a religious story as such, but a secular one about pragmatism, practicality, in the face of adversity. Not long after her installation as queen, Mordecai found out about a plot to assassinate the king. He told Esther, who in turn warned the king. The plotters were hanged, and Mordecai's warning was recorded in the court annals. Esther saves Mordecai. Esther 3:8-14. The story in chapters 3-8 gives details of a personal conflict that escalates into nationwide persecution against the Jewish people. Mordecai refused to bow to the highest court official, Haman the Agagite. Mordecai's refusal to bow was a grave insult in a court with strict protocol, and a feud started between the two men. Haman was infuriated when he saw that Mordecai did not bow down or do obeisance, show respect to him. But he thought it beneath him to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So, having been told who Mordecai's people were, Haman plotted to destroy all the Jews. Read Esther 3:1-15. There is no reason given for Mordecai's refusal to bow. It was not against everyday Jewish practice to bow to a ruler or representative. See Joseph and his brothers in Egypt, Genesis 43:26. However, Mordecai's ancestor Saul had been an enemy of Haman's ancestor Agag, king of the Amalekites. See 1 Samuel 15. And this may have been Mordecai's reason. In any case, he did not follow the accepted practice, and thereby placed himself and others in danger. 2 Persian court officials. Haman's anger shifted. It had been focused on Mordecai, but finding that Mordecai was a Jew, his fury expanded to include the whole Jewish people. In a scene that formed a blueprint for anti-Semitic propaganda, Haman fed the mind of the king with ideas about a people who were different, who obeyed different laws, and who were a danger to the kingdom. He sought the final solution. Read Esther 4:1-17. "The Jews," said Haman, "must be eliminated for the kingdom's good." The king agreed, not knowing that Esther, his beloved queen, and Mordecai, the man he owed his life to, were Jews. A day was set aside for the slaughter, and a decree was issued to every corner of the empire. Sacral of, for, or relating to sacred rites or symbols, kingship. The king is a god. The king's absolute power seems strange to us, accustomed as we are to the democratic rule of law. However, in many parts of the ancient world, a king was considered a living god. He was a sacred person who embodied in his person the state or kingdom that he governed. His physical body was not immortal, but he was thought of as someone more than human, with a special and unique connection with the immortal gods. Because of this, he could do what he wanted, even when, as in this case, it was unjust. Israel rejected this concept of sacral kingship. From the earliest times, it saw God as its ruler. Its laws came from God, not from the state. When it did have kings like David or Solomon, it emphasized their humanity. In the Israelite mind, kingship was very close to tyranny and had to be constantly hedged around, circumvented, with precautions to stop it from becoming a despot, tyrant. In the crisis that was about to engulf him, Mordecai turned to Esther. She alone could save the Jewish people from the stupidity and cruelty of her husband, the king. However, there was a problem. Esther had not been summoned into the royal presence for 30 days, an ominous sign that she might be losing favor in his eyes. To approach her husband without being first commanded was breaking the law, and she would be punished by immediate death. She was aware of this, but her reaction was fatalistic. "If I die, I die." Esther risks death. Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will also fast as you do. After that I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. As soon as the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won his favor, and he held out to her the golden scepter that was in his hand. Ahasuerus seemed charmed by her unexpected appearance. Taking advantage of his good humor, she asked him if he and Haman would come to a banquet she meant to hold. He agreed. Haman suspected nothing, believing he was being honored by her invitation. He and the king attended the banquet, and Ahasuerus promised Esther that she could have anything she wanted, even half his kingdom. This was an extravagant offer, highlighting the foolish recklessness of the king. Esther asked that the king and Haman attend a second banquet the next day. The king agreed. In high spirits, Haman returned to his home and ordered the erection of a gallows to hang the enemy he hated, Mordecai. However, during the night, Ahasuerus could not sleep. He told his servants to read from the records of his reign. As they read, he was reminded of the good deed of Mordecai. He realized he had never rewarded him, and decided to remedy this. As it happened, Haman was there, and the king asked him how he could reward someone who had been a remarkable servant. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What shall be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor?" Haman is caught in his trap. Haman, thinking the king was referring to himself, recommended extravagant rewards. The king agreed, but then astonished Haman by telling him that he wanted to reward Mordecai. Haman was mortified by his mistake and hated Mordecai even more. Zeresh, the wife of Haman, warned him, but he was now so eaten up by hatred that he could not turn from the path he was following. Read Esther 7:1-10. Meanwhile, Esther's banquet had been prepared. Ahasuerus was so pleased that he again promised Esther anything she wanted. There is a similar story. In Herodotus' book 9:109-113, there is a similar story where the Persian King Xerxes promises his wife a mistress. As time went on, however, the truth came to light, and in such manner as I will show. Xerxes' wife, a mistress, gave him a tremendous gaily colored mantle, cloak, marvelous to see. Xerxes was pleased with it and went to Artente wearing it. Being pleased with her too, he asked her what she wanted in return for her favors, for he would deny nothing at her asking. Thereupon, for she and all her house were doomed to evil, she said to Xerxes, "Will you give me whatever I ask of you?" He promised this, supposing that she would ask anything but that. When he had sworn, she asked boldly for his mantle. Xerxes tried to refuse her for no reason, except that he feared that a mistress might have clear proof of his doing what she already guessed. He accordingly offered her cities instead, and gold in abundance, and an army for none but herself to command. Armies are the most suitable of gifts in Persia, but as he could not move her, he gave her the mantle, and she, rejoicing greatly in the gift, went flaunting her finery. Herodotus book 9:109-1113. As you would guess, this story also ends in torture and bloodshed. Esther responds to Ahasuerus' promise with a much more significant request in the Bible story. She asks that her life be spared and her people saved. "From whom?" asked the king. "From Haman," replied Esther. When the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman had thrown himself on the couch where Esther was reclining, and the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?" Haman was trapped. He was taken out by the king's servants and hanged from the gallows he had built for Mordecai. See Bible heroes. Mordecai. He begged for his life but did not indicate that he had experienced any change of heart. He did not repent of his hatred for the Jewish population. Esther had saved Mordecai from Haman, but the Jewish population was still in danger. Esther saves the Jewish people in Persia. Read Esther 8:1-17. The king held out the golden scepter to Esther, and Esther rose and stood before the king. Esther pleaded with the king. She said, "If it pleases the king, and if I have won his favor, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I have his approval, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote giving orders to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. How can I bear to see the calamity that is coming on my people? Alternatively, how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred?" So letters were again sent to every corner of the empire, halting the order of execution on the Jewish population. Esther had made not a single false move. In the harem, as a young girl in training to be a wife and queen, in danger, coolly keeping her head instead of panicking. Her speech in 856 showed her skill in diplomacy. The Jews were not only saved from death, they could also attack those people who had been their enemies and could claim their property. On the very day that they were to have been annihilated, they turned the tables by destroying all those who had sought to kill them. Thousands were killed, including the 10 sons of Haman. Read Esther 9:1-32. The Jewish people kept the day as a unique festival called Purim from that day on. It was a day when gifts were exchanged among members of each family and presents given to the poor. The book of Esther reflects the situation of the diaspora, and one of the reasons it was produced was undoubtedly to address the needs of the Jewish community living outside Palestine. The story is set after the exile and is part of the post-exilic period of Israelite history when many Jews were living away from the homeland of Judah. As is often observed, there is no concern for items and ideas that feature prominently in other Israelite literature: land promised to the ancestors, the Jerusalem cult, Torah observation, or an autonomous Israelite state under a divinely appointed monarch. The book of Esther does not suggest that the goal of good Jewish living is to return to Judah. Instead, It promotes the idea that Jews can live personally, fulfilling, and even socially successful lives in exile from Palestine. It asks, who are we if we not only do not live in Judah, but also do not even want to? Although it seems that the young women had no choice about the length and nature of their preparation when their turn arrived and they were moved from the harem to the king's private quarters, they had some say about how they presented themselves. Whatever the girl asked for may have included items of clothing or jewelry or aphrodisiac foods. Some of the descriptions of preparations for lovemaking in Song of Songs provide possible insight here. The writer does not supply the details, but leaves that to the reader's imagination. The provision of anything contrasts with Esther's modest request in verse 2:15, and is a feature of Esther's queenship. She is often given a chance to ask for anything. When the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch, was in charge of the harem, suggested. Moreover, Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. What are the main themes in Esther's story? Let God be your ruler. Esther's story was a political satire, showing the danger of giving absolute power to someone who might be a fool. Ahasuerus was governed by whim rather than by wisdom, becoming the tool of anyone shrewd enough to exploit him. The lesson is clear: do not give too much power to anyone. God alone should rule us in the long run. Right living. The book of Esther was written for diaspora Jews, Jews who lived outside Israel, to show them how to live in exile. If they encounter bigotry and prejudice, they must act with courage, wisdom, and integrity. The origin of Purim. The story explains the origin of a significant Jewish feast day. Names in Esther's story. Esther means hidden. Her Jewish identity was hidden from the king. Esther's Jewish name Hadassah means myrtle, a tree whose leaves release their fragrance when crushed. Ahasuerus means ruler of heroes. It is based on the Persian emperor Xerxes, whom Leonidas fought with the famous 300. Vashti means sweetheart or beloved. Esther and Mordecai's names may be related to stories about the Persian deities Ishtar and Marduk. Ishtar was the Babylonian goddess of love. Marduk was the principal male god of Babylon. Haman and Vashti may correspond to the Elamite gods Haman and Mashti. These similarities suggest that the book of Esther was based on an older Babylonian story that the Jewish people heard during the Babylonian exile. Esther is described in all versions of the book of Esther as the Jewish queen of a Persian king, Ahasuerus. In the narrative, Ahasuerus seeks a new wife after his queen. Vashti refuses to obey him, and Esther is chosen for her beauty. The king's chief advisor, Haman, is offended by Esther's cousin and guardian, Mordecai, and gets permission to have all the Jews in the kingdom killed. Esther foils the plan and wins permission from the king for the Jews to kill their enemies, and they do so. Her story provides a traditional background for Purim, celebrated on the date given in the story for when Haman's order was to go into effect, which is the same day that the Jews killed their enemies after the plan was reversed.